I see in your eyes the same fear that would take the heart of me. A day may come when the courage of men fails, but it is not this day.
Where do hobbits come from?
For Frodo.
We know through the Tolkien lore the origins of the elves, the origins of men, of dwarves, of ents, and orcs, but there's a strange omission in the history of Middle-earth as to where hobbits originate from. And I have some theories. Before the first age of Middle-earth, there were the years of the trees, where the first elves were awakened. About 100 years later, men were born onto Middle-earth, far to the east, and the first age began. Both of these beings were created by the supreme god Ilúvatar. The dwarves were awakened around the same time as men. These were created by Aiule, one of the beings of power called Anwar, created by Ilúvatar to help create the world of Middle-earth. One of the Anwar, Yavanna, feared the dwarves would destroy the forest, so she created Ents. The first orcs were created by Melkor, the most evil Anwar, by capturing some of the elves and torturing them, twisting them into the evil orcs we know today. It wasn't until the beginning of the Third Age that hobbits were first found in Middle-earth, in the Andean Valley in the shadow of Mirkwood. When they were discovered by dwarves and men at the start of the Third Age, they had already established themselves in homes and villages, implying they had been there for a while. After Sauron's first defeat, darkness was cast over Mirkwood and caused the hobbits to make the arduous journey across the Misty Mountains, moving to what is now the Shire. It's clear by this description that hobbits have been thriving in Middle-earth for years, probably centuries before they were discovered by the other races. They even divided themselves into 3 groups, the Fallowhides, the Harfoots, and the Stores, all genetically diverse. But the question arises once more, where did these strange small folk come from? In the extended lore of Tolkien, it is said that hobbits are more closely kin to humans, making many people believe they're just a subrace of humans, like the Númenóreans. But how does this explain the oddities of the hobbit? Their ears pointed like elves, how they walk silently, similar to what elves are known for. They are also hardier than men. When Frodo was stabbed in the shoulder by Aman-Sul, he withstood 17 days before he was healed. After the chief Nazgul hits Merry in Pelennor, Aragorn says the hobbits are hardy despite their small stature. Now, I believe it is possible that hobbits are closely related to the race of men, but only in part. I believe their origins lie in the Avari. After the Battle of the Valar against the evil Melkor, Middle-earth was left in tatters. In the early years of the First Age, the elves were summoned to the Undying Lands of the far west, and many elves went there to behold the beauty of these lands and to continue living forever. However, there were those that chose to stay behind in the east. Those elves were known as the Avari, the unwilling. These elves stayed in the wild, living in the forests in the eastern lands, but many of the lands beyond the Rhûn were left in tatters after the Great War, so it's reasonable the Avari made their way westerly over the centuries. Now, there's a clear difference between elves and hobbits, and the story of the Avari were lost to time, but my theory is that the men of the eastern lands met with the Avari and bred with them, giving birth to a new congregation of half-elves. Now, half-elves at birth are given the choice to live in the world of men or the world of elves, and live an immortal life. And more than likely, many of these half-elves chose to live in the world of men, living the same lifespan as that of men. This might be a reference to hobbits being closer kin to men than that of elves, especially because most hobbits live about the same length of time as men do. Now, after generations of these half-elves breeding with one another, it's possible they began to show consistent traits with one another. The Avari elves as a whole already had some similarities, being elves that chose to stay behind. So it's likely some consistent traits carried through over millennia, like an aversion to adventure. A study of gray foxes in Russia showed that breeding foxes with calmer temperaments that were more social around people caused some very distinct physical appearances in the more domesticated foxes in as little as 10 years. These foxes were not only more docile and friendly towards humans, but they showed white spots, curly tails, floppy ears, and other physical differentiators from their more wild cousins. It is now believed that the same gene that was connected to domestication brought with it genes of floppy ears and curly tails, and so on. Similarly, maybe over thousands of generations of these half-Avari elves, genes connected to a similar nature could have brought with it shorter stature, even growing as short as the size of hobbits are known today, especially because they were likely separated from the rest of the inhabitants of Middle-earth, mainly breeding with one another. Maybe at the beginning of the Third Age, after nearly 6,000 years, the Avari had descended into what we call hobbits. The Avari themselves likely all died out over the millennia, succumbing to the wasting disease since they never returned to the Undying Lands. But their Hobbit children kept some of their inherent genetic traits, like stronger resistance to dark magic and poison, their fleet of foot, their pointy ears, and their love of nature and all things growing and green. Elves themselves were considered a sibling race to man, so it's not too far off to believe these halflings were equally close to both men and elves. Tolkien himself even said, "Elves and men are evidently, in biological terms, one race, or they could not breed and produce fertile offspring." This may be a stretch bringing genetic manipulation into a story with such high fantasy lore as The Lord of the Rings, and maybe in the end the gods just thought the world needed some little people to watch over and protect the world of nature in Middle-earth, and so had hobbits crawl out of the hole in the ground. Both theories sound just as plausible to me. If you enjoyed this episode of Pizza Slice Pop Culture, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe for more videos from your favorite pop culture channel, Co-Optimistic.